Whoa. You're early, yes. Oh my God. Hmm. I think we're going to be debating selector theory. Oh my God. And the chatters are going crazy. I feel okay. Selector theory. I'll give like a full description of it when I get into talking to him. But basically it's the idea that like when there's like a more academic summary. I'll give like the super layman's version, which is that like democracy is good and that like when you have democratic institutions, the government tends to distribute more public goods and therefore is um, is better. So yeah, exciting. Mm. Okay. Cool. Um, oh my God. Okay, so my girlfriend is in the other room, and I think we'll start in like soon. Originally, they start at 1 p.m. Pacific, and then I should join when they start. Mhm. So, probably very soon. Um, Probably within the next 10 minutes, but we'll see. I do feel like quite awkward because my girlfriend is in the other room. I'm not debating on whether ducks are bad. I only vaguely know like the lore that like Adam is big into feeding ducks, and he is oft made fun of for this. I'll make sure if the debate is going south, I'll be like, fucking, you're just making these points to show off to your duck buddies. Hit him with some duck based jabs. So far in this interaction tree, you've selected the mentioned girlfriend option 3 times in a row. Yeah, because my thoughts are a little bit scattered and I keep not finishing it. Um, Adam is a duck simp. Yeah, I'll make sure to get him with that good. I also think that I'm probably going to do a discussion on the Adam Walsh documentary Saturday morning, 9 a.m. I'm also getting roped into something on Saturday and Friday. Whoa, tough J. So true. Tough. Yeah, I don't know. I'm a little bit nervous about doing the conversation. Hopefully, I think probably be pretty amicable. Not spoken to them before. We have mutual friends though, like Perspective. I have seen Arcane. I've talked about Arcane here before, but I really liked it. I especially liked it because I think it very accurately captures like the advantages and disadvantages of like highly traditionalist ordered systems versus chaotic systems. I've skilled for them to talk to you and vice versa for a bit, but there are three critical questions they ask every guest. What are the three critical questions? So I can be prepared. Or is that a meme? You should tell me. It's a meme. Whoa. Asked and held your answer. Okay, I got a Zoom meeting link. So I'm going to jump into that and begin talking to them. Ooh, it's got to install Zoom. Video. OBS virtual camera. Okay, that should be good. Oh, 1 second. I cannot hear you.
Ready to.
Ooh, I hear you now.
Nice.
Nice.
You can hear me now?
Wow.
So good, yeah. coming in beautifully.
There's a chat here. So nice to work with YouTubers who have professional audio setups. Oh my God.
Like Destiny?
Well, that was a little fucked up. So I listened to your talk with Bosch.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, nice.
Is it Taft Taj? How do I pronounce that name?
Yeah,
We're not
however you
live, by
want.
the way. So.
Okay, I am live, by the way. So.
Oh, okay.
Sorry, just
Good to
for
know.
warning. Yeah,
You won't
don't
drop
go on
any
any crazy
gamer
rants,
words.
please.
Yeah.
No
Yes.
gamer words.
Well, I guess I already did. I was saying Sitch already threw Destiny under the bus for his
Ooh.
fucking crap audio. What
Another
the fuck?
bridge burned. Unbelievable.
There you go.
Can you burn a bridge with Destiny? I don't know. He seems pretty.
It's preemptive.
Yeah.
Hmm.
I mean, he's ready to burn all bridges for them.
Well, I wasn't going to talk shit about your conversation with Bosch, but I was going to say, I don't know. It occurred to me because Rudyard did this thing with Vosh as well about whether or not the civil rights movement led into the social justice movement.
Mhm.
And I think Sitch might have different feelings on this, but I'm like, is that really an important argument? I don't know that it is.
I think
Wait,
it is
what?
important because you should be able to differentiate between like liberal arguments for civil rights and like more leftist ones.
It is important in
Yes,
that. It is important.
exactly.
It is important in that sense. And that's where you may sway me. But we'll talk more about this once we go
Yeah.
live. We
Yeah,
should go
for
live
sure.
on our
I think it's really interesting.
I mean, when you're
I
talking to
hit-
Vosh, it's like talking to a brick wall. but
Yeah, exactly.
That's a
You-
different question.
It was, yeah, it was a difficult conversation.
You don't mind if I put you on our stream, do you?
No, that's fine.
Okay. I'll work on that.
Okay, I'm gonna press the button. Or do you have her up yet?
Go ahead and press the button. What do you care?
Mm.
You know how we roll.
Okay. Okay. Well, considering I'm watching how you're cropping the the video.
Look at this.
Okay.
Look, our
it's-
guest is floating in.
There you go.
Like my new background. Look at that background.
Yeah.
Just
there you
Just
go.
put it together for you.
Beautiful.
Go live.
I'm pressing the button. Don't
They
worry.
want the animated effect.
Nobody wants the animated.
Come on.
Adam,
look at this.
you dragging around little.
We have a quality show here. Look at this animated effect we have.
Every time someone who doesn't watch our show regularly takes like a screenshot of like you just sticking like a million faces on the screen, they're like, everyone's like, what is this terrible graphic design of this stream? It's just chaos. It's a bunch of faces and names.
You don't like it?
No,
Uh,
I don't like it.
Taft Taj.
Hey now,
Whoa.
it's your
hello.
boy PSA Sitch here with another Tuesday stream with everyone's favorite worst graphic designer on the internet, Adam Prender.
What's
And
up,
today-
everybody?
We're joined by a very special guest, Taft Taj, who Adam is trying to give everyone in the audience a seizure by flipping the screen around so much.
I am animating this fancy intro
Please
for
stop.
you guys. Look
Please
at the
stop.
guest. Look at the guest coming in.
Please stop.
Animated style.
He's-
There you go.
How are you doing
All
today, Tom?
right.
I'm doing all right.
That's good.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah, I was going to ask a question, but now I forgot what it was.
Well, we were talking
I was
about
gonna ask you about.
Vosh.
Yes.
No, I was going to ask you about my graphic design skill.
Oh, I didn't see them, but if they are,
Okay.
if you are as passionate about graphic design as you are about ducks, I'm sure it's amazing.
About what?
Ducks.
Oh, oh, ducks. Yeah. Yes, I do have a thing. I do have a thing. Oh my God, you're winning my heart over here. She knows that we like ducks.
She
I
knows
do.
about the dog.
I've
Taft's a
caught
fan.
I've
She knows
caught
all the
enough of
memes,
your
yeah.
streams to know that meme at least.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah.
But we were arguing on Twitter, I think, about elite theory and selectorate theory. So we're going to talk a bit
Right.
about that. I did watch your stream with Vosh, and we talked a little bit before the stream began, so maybe we'll just continue with that dialogue about whether or not there was a big debate between Vosh and another YouTuber named What If Alt Hist. Also, I think his name is Rudyard, and there was a discussion in that debate about whether or not the social justice movement is an extension of the civil rights movement. And you went on a talk with Vosh to try to convince Vosh that that Rudyard was correct and that this social justice movement is not an extension of civil rights. And it was kind of like talking to a brick wall because Vosh was just adamant about how he is correct on this matter. I think Vosh wants to think of himself as like a civil rights icon. So I don't think you're going to make a lot of headway with Vosh, but
Well, I think the thing is,
oh, go ahead.
well, everyone loves and sort of like respects the civil rights movement. And it's like very much this cornerstone of modern politics to like pay homage to it. And so I think people on both sides tend to try to like claim it. And the complicated reality is that like there are elements of the civil rights movement that were like very leftist in nature. And there were elements that were liberal in nature. And I think it's just important to like disambiguate about which parts were which and which parts ultimately made headway in actually achieving changes.
See, and I said something controversial before we started because I just, when you were arguing this with Vosh, it just dawned on me that this seems like a completely irrelevant debate because even if Vosh is correct, which I actually don't think he is, even if we lived in a world where he was correct and that was the situation, the movement could have shifted and become illiberal, which I think is what all of our critiques of it is. Right?
How could you say something so stupid, Adam?
Well, okay.
Well, I guess I'm not.
Way in here.
Well,
You're saying that like in theory it could have started liberal but then shifted to be illiberal, and that would really be a problem regardless of whether it started that way.
Correct. Yeah. So the archaeological find of the movement isn't necessarily indicative of what the modern movement is. All the time things start off, with the right kind of attitude, and then some dark specter waves over the movement and suddenly it becomes illiberal. So that's really the problem.
But the reason it's important is because there is this lie that's being told, that's being used to trick mainstream liberals to get them on board with this, which is to say that this new brand of wokeness is just the continuation of the civil rights movement. And that's why it is important, Adam. That's why you can't just dismiss it as not relevant.
Yeah, so Vosh's argument is that like, look at the civil rights movement. It was good, right? Everyone thinks it was good. Well, that was us. That's what we're trying to do now. So if you like the civil rights movement, you should like what we're trying to do now. And so I think the reason to like be skeptical of that narrative is because really like the civil rights movement was much more complicated than just being like a direct ideological origin to like the current social justice movement.
Right.
Yeah. And if you can distinguish that in people's minds and say, there was the civil rights movement was not just the racists and the liberals, it was the racists, the liberals, and the radicals. And if you can make that distinction to people and point to and say, look, the wokeness is actually the continuation of the Black separatists and the Black nationalists and the socialists and the more radical elements, I think that can be used to effectively wake people up to what's going on.
Well, if it's rhetorically valuable, I get that. I totally get that. So I guess my big question is whether or not this is the battle to fight, or are there more effective battles to fight?
Yeah, I mean, there are more effective battles to fight. It's just like, I think the reason why this is an important battleground is just like countering the narrative that is put out by like left-wingers like Vosh.
Right.
And so like without that, then I don't think it's necessarily a battle that's like worth fighting, because you can just critique like a movement on its, on its philosophical arguments itself. And that's like much more head-on and direct.
Well, the thing is it if someone comes out and the claim is that the social justice movement is an extension of the civil rights movement. That's the claim. If you come out and say no, it's not an extension of the civil rights movement, and there are all these ideological differences, or frame it like Sitch just did. There were all these players in the civil rights movement, and the social justice movement is made up of the losers of those players. I think you could just as easily say, ideologically, it's diverged enough from the civil rights movement that you can't really claim it's part of it any longer.
Yeah, and I would make an argument like that. And I think that it's just important to like know what you're talking about when you're critiquing something. And so like the reason as well to do this is just like in discussing differences between the civil rights movement and the modern social justice movement, you're figuring out what exactly the modern social justice movement is and what its boundaries are, what it's arguing for, and how it's arguing for those things. And if you, in that process, find out that like the modern social justice movement makes arguments that are not based on like liberal like equality under law and colorblindness and these sort of principles of just like universality, and instead is making arguments about like, well, we need to section off into identity groups and like wield power through that, and we need to engage in this like strict redistributive policy, and we need to label everything that doesn't engage in that redistribution as racist and so on. I think that that's really useful. It's like really identify what is being argued by the modern social justice movement. I will say, just like in regards to, you're saying that like arguing with Vosh is like slamming your head into a brick wall. It's definitely a unique experience because I felt like so frequently in that debate, I would say something, and then we'd like quibble over it a lot. And then he would eventually say something that like seemed to just like affirm my argument. So like there was this moment where he was like, well, things that used to be radical become like normalized now and are like no longer considered radical. And so like he was making the point that like, well, the liberal arguments back then were considered radical. And I was like, yes, but like, I guess I'm trying to make the point that like there's leftist movements, and even if the liberal elements are radical, there's also radical leftist movements, and like that's the real distinction here. So
well, yeah, and the radicals didn't win, obviously. Where he has a conception that the radicals did win, which isn't true.
Yeah, as far as like the civil rights movement and the various wings within it, like the more radical wing did not win. Yeah.
I don't even know. I mean, I don't even think it's fair to characterize what MLK and the moderates were pushing for as radical for that time period. I mean, sure, in like segregated areas of the South, but most of the North was pretty on board with, getting rid of legal segregation. I don't think it was that radical to be like, well, it was two things. One is that I don't think it was that radical, but secondly, even more important than that, is that what MLK and the moderates were arguing for like fit neatly within our liberal framework.
Mhm.
And that's the real question, whether
Yeah.
it was radical or not. It fit within our version of liberalism under American ideas, where the woke stuff is the antithesis of that, is anti-liberalism.
Yeah, really, like Martin Luther King and the moderates are pointing to the US Constitution and to liberal ideals. And they're telling Americans, you are not living up to your own ideals. And that
Right.
message really resonated with people. And it's very different than like the modern social justice movement, which is saying, look at these liberal ideals. They're rooted in racism and need to be like totally reevaluated.
Exactly.
So yeah, definitely different. But I'm glad that you watched it. It was definitely, I'm not a very aggressive debater. I tend to be like very friendly, which I think is something that I will get more comfortable with, like pinning people down on points. But yeah.
I'm trying to be a less aggressive debater.
Oh, really?
You guys should trade each other's energy.
I know.
Well, you can do I don't know if you've seen, like whenever Jonathan Haidt's in one of these interviews where someone disagrees with him, he's like always friendly and he'll just kind of agree with whatever they say. And then when it's his turn to talk, he'll just
Right.
kind of like nicely disagree with them and tell them why they're wrong.
I think that's a good
I
model.
think
I recently read
it's a good
The
model.
Coddling of the
Before
American
we-
Mind, and it was really good.
Yeah, before we move off the social justice civil rights thing, I just want to say that I noticed in that debate a lot there, you get in this comparison game where it really is, it makes the right look bad because it allows a person to bring up all of the genuinely racist tactics that took place during the civil rights movement and compare those to tactics now, which I would categorize as not racist, but it paints those tactics or paints those. It's not even really tactics. It's more like just a disagreement over various aspects of the social justice movement. Mostly the fact that a lot of the prescriptions that they have are genuinely illiberal and racist. They're actually the racists on the side in this struggle. So that I think is part of the reason that I don't like the comparison. And I just feel like you'd be better off, rather than saying, having this conversation about the civil rights movement versus the modern social justice movement, just moving into, it doesn't really matter the roots of it. Let's try to define the modern social justice movement today. And then you don't have to address all that racist shit that took place during the civil rights movement. Does that make sense? Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, so you're saying that like it allows connections between those who oppose the civil rights movement then and those who oppose like modern social justice now. And by like even comparing these two groups, you're sort of casting like the people who disagree with them in the same general category.
Racist light, yeah.
That's interesting. I think that like
the conservative movement, the history of the conservative movement is really like the racists of the South, right? That were against integration and stuff like that. I mean, I would say that the conservative movement, my conception of conservatism is just in favor of the status quo, the traditions that are working now. And if the tradition really is slavery or segregation or whatever it is, conservatives are going to be in favor of it. So if you are in a racist culture, it's going to be conservatives that are going to be conserving that racist culture. But I think today, I don't think the culture is racist, and conservatives are actually the ones that are helping conserve, liberalism.
I think that's true to an extent. The reason why I think that your point about sort of casting the opposition as similar is like not, applicable in this case is because like it's another reason why it's good to make distinctions between these two ideological movements, the civil rights movement and modern social justice. And it's because like the people who oppose these movements are going to be different groups if they are in fact different, ideologically, they have different ideological origins. The people who oppose them are going to be different. And so when you look at like the civil rights movement and the moderate wing of that, and the people who are arguing like Martin Luther King did, that you're not living up to your own liberal principles, the people who are against that are people who are against living up to liberal principles, who do believe there should be a distinction between how the government is treating people of one race or another. And so when you establish that that is the ideological positions of that time and that debate, and then you establish that those positions shift, and then you have, the modern civil right or the modern social justice movement, which is arguing that liberal principles are like not so good, that they need to be reevaluated, that they're rooted in racism and so on. And the people on the opposition to that are in fact the liberals and the people who are arguing for like equality and racial blindness under the law and so on. And so like by making the distinction, you're able to show, in fact, that the opposition party is not the same, and that even though they're both like considered to be on the right in this sense, they have in fact very different ideological goals. And so I think that's another good reason why it's important to make the distinction between modern civil rights and in civil rights in the 60s.
It was racists that were against the civil rights movement in the 60s, correct? I mean, I feel like that's pretty.
Yeah, I mean, at least that's like certainly a big reason why people opposed it.
Now I'm of the opinion that it's racists who are in favor of the modern social justice movement. Mm-hmm. They're just racist against whites.
Yeah, I mean, there's this like weird definitions game, but like we can both agree that like fundamentally the modern social justice movement and the racists of the past were both against the kind of racial equality under the law and the colorblindness that is characteristic of liberal philosophy.
And that's in the 60s, right?
Right.
Yeah. Okay.
So that's kind of how I would phrase it. I think like racism is such like a difficult term to talk about because like,
well, what do you think is going on today though? If there is a racist and a non-racist divide in the modern social justice movement, I mean, I would say that the people who are against, most of the people who are against social justice, including conservatives, are against it because it's racist.
I think they would make that argument, but I think in order to make that argument, they've got to use language in a way that like the other side is not using language. And I think that's why it's like sort of difficult because like I can agree. And I think that like the way that you're using racism is just in this like very plain language way, which is to say
well, no,
that like,
I'm using it in the old school definition of
Right,
racism,
right.
obviously. Yeah.
and I think they would disagree with that definition. And so they would like kind of make the same argument, right? Like Ibram X. Kendi like famously says that like anything that isn't anti-racist, that is to say anything that isn't explicitly in favor of Black and brown people is racist. And so
Right.
like I think yeah,
So ironic.
which I think is like an insane definition of racism.
Anything
to be
that
clear.
isn't racist in favor of blacks is racist.
Right,
It's like,
right.
what?
And so there's also this whole like prejudice versus power thing, which is, you know, it sort of makes sense when you're in a college course and you're being told this by a distinguished professor and like no one is able to really argue against it effectively. But like when you look out into the real world, like the guy in my hometown who goes like screaming across the street with like Confederate flags waving from his truck, that person is not someone who has institutional power. The people who have like institutional power are like journalists at the Washington Post. And so you really quickly get into this like mess where it's like not obvious who is racist and who isn't. I agree with you in like the plain language definition though.
Do you disagree with me that like critical race theory is racist against whites? I know
I think it
sometimes people,
explicitly favors Black and brown people over white people and intentionally.
okay. Right. Okay. So you're basically saying the same thing. I know people freak out about that because you know, obviously they're
I mean, they shouldn't. That's the goal, right? Is to like
right.
correct for historic injustices by favoring one group now over another.
Well, we also don't, anyone who's a majority, you know, you don't want people to, you know, organize based on race. We've spent a lot of time,
Right.
we've spent a lot of time in America trying to avoid people organizing along the lines of race.
Mhm.
Different minorities do organize along the lines of race, and we kind of look the other way because they don't have a majority. And in democracies, it's the majority that you really have to be concerned about. Like if a majority organizes along the lines of race, then you can get into some real nasty situations. So that's why more and more, we should be moving more towards fewer and fewer people organizing via race, even if you're in the minority. But we don't seem to be going in that direction.
I mean, not only that, like in a democracy, if you have a minority interest that is like very specialized and very highly motivated to
Right.
engage with the political system, they can actually have a huge impact, especially when you get into like local districting and stuff. And so
True. Yeah.
I think that like we should be like, you know, concerned with the actions of like small minorities that do have significant impacts in government. And yeah, I agree that like one of the special things about America has been historically its ability to like integrate different minority populations into the general culture. And that's something that's like really unique about America and really cool. And in the past, it's like been referred to as like the melting pot, right? And that narrative has been sort of challenged recently by people who believe that like, well, we shouldn't have a melting pot. We should have like a salad, and you know, everyone mixes together, but are essentially retaining like their separate and unique qualities. But that does cause like friction and tension with different groups that might have, you know, very competing values and a desire to advocate for their own interests over the interests of others, because they're not seeing it as like a, you know, a collective aspirational goal, everyone's Americans, but rather we are separate people. So I agree that that's like dangerous and destructive to democracy when people start seeing themselves and their own racial group as like something that needs to be specially protected. Yeah.
Sitch, you want to say anything more about social justice and civil rights? I know
No,
you
I
use
think,
this a lot.
I think you guys covered it pretty well.
Do you, I mean, you see my dilemma here with the, like, people just conceptualize the civil rights movement as racist on one side and good old Americans on the other.
Yeah. Okay.
And the social justice movement, you know, complicates that, especially when you're talking about the conservatives inheriting, when you, as soon as you start saying, you know, talking about the inheritance of the social justice movement, you're kind of forced to talk about the inheritance of the opposite side of that civil rights movement.
Yeah, but well, not
which-
really. I mean, if you, the party switch kind of came after that anyway,
Mhm.
because if you look at I was looking at the votes for the 1964 Civil Rights Act, and it's not split by party, it's split by North-South
Right.
location. And even though there were more Democrats that voted in favor of it, there were also more Democrats that voted against it than Republicans.
Really? That's interesting to know.
Yeah.
Okay.
So,
And then the sorting took place after that because
Yeah,
of the
yeah.
civil rights.
and it took place
movement.
over, you know, decades and decades and decades. It's not like 1 year everything switched or anything.
Yeah,
So-
obviously.
But I mean, that's my point in the beginning, is that's why you have to draw that distinction between, you know, how the civil rights movement was won on the backs of liberal principles, and this current social justice movement is anti-liberal.
Yes.
The problem is that I don't think the Republicans or the right wing in America will ever make that argument, because they gain too much benefit looking at all the weird woke stuff and saying this is the left, this is liberals, this is the left, this is liberals, because they want to use that as like the hammer to sledge the Democrats with. So they don't really
Right.
want to draw that ideological distinction.
Yeah, even on the party switch thing, I know conservatives can't stand the idea of the party switch,
Right.
because they don't want to. Racism is so hated in our society right now.
It's like the cardinal
The
sin.
party, the party, they don't want to. They want to acknowledge the fact that there were a whole lot of racist Democrats, which I think we should acknowledge. Obviously,
of course.
yeah. So, yeah, it's just being used for that. So I guess maybe we'll move on to like elite theory versus selector theory.
Yeah, we can move on to that. I could also probably debate you on the trans stuff later, because I think you've had takes that I disagree with. But
Me or Sid?
I think you, Adam. But
Oh
Yeah.
no, it's
Yeah.
me. Is it my, because I watched the What is a Woman debate, or What is a Woman documentary,
Mhm.
and I'm leaning more towards Sitch's position.
oh,
now.
really? What's Sitch's
That
position?
maybe, well, he's saying that you shouldn't be able to transition unless you have gender dysphoria, and I'm like,
Oh,
fuck it,
the trans
America.
medicalist take.
Yeah,
the-
if you wanna, if
the
you
true scum take, yes.
if you just want to transition because you think, hell yeah, go for it. I mean, I'm prone to not say no to that. I mean, obviously not for children, but for adults, if adults want to transition without gender dysphoria, who am I to say no?
Yeah, I think the problem is that like it ties into these sorts of like political arguments. And so like a lot of people identify as trans because it's this like politically expedient way to like align yourself with gender abolitionists and like pro freedom of expression against like conservative gender norms. But that doesn't
Right.
necessarily mean they have like a genuine psychological need for hormones. And so the problem with like these people transitioning is that it's sort of, one, it can have bad effects later down the road. So like if you're chemically castrating yourself or causing yourself to grow facial hair, or if you're removing like you're getting a double mastectomy, you may genuinely regret that in the future. So that's like a risk if you're transitioning without dysphoria. It's much higher if you're transitioning without dysphoria. And the other problem is that like it really muddies the water with like policy. So like consider a policy that says if someone is a trans woman and they've committed a crime, you know, they're going to be housed in the women's prison because we can't expect them to detransition. Well, if you have a significant number of people who are transitioning without dysphoria, it might in fact be reasonable to expect them to detransition because they don't actually have a medical need to present as female. And so if it is true, in fact, that like a significant or, you know, just like non-zero portion of trans people are transitioning without dysphoria, then you really remove that medical need to transition. And a lot of trans advocacy arguments fall apart.
So what is my position that you don't, what have I said that has not been correct?
Tell Adam
in your
how he's wrong.
estimation? Yeah.
I think it's been like too long. I don't remember what I disagreed with you on. I think that like I tend to be quite conservative on like a lot of trans stuff, but then like occasionally even then, I think I'll hear you like say something and be like, I don't agree with that. I don't remember exactly what it was though, but I'm just
Well, it
throwing
must
it
have
out as
not
a
been that
potential
bad
topic.
if you did, like.
It didn't
must-
stick with me. It
No.
didn't crush my heart.
It was so bad she had to block it out of her
Yeah,
mind.
no,
It
I have-
created
I
a
have-
trauma.
I do
Exactly.
understand what you're saying. I do understand what you're saying about politically trans versus, I mean,
It's like being politically black.
Yeah, it is like being
Biologic-
politically black.
is it biologically trans? I guess you're biologically trans if you have gender dysphoria. So
Well, no, it's like with the political black thing. Like in order to be truly trans, you have to accept all the political ideology.
Mhm.
Yeah,
that
no,
comes
I
with
yeah.
it. It's-
Yeah,
And,
and like
she's saying people become politically trans and then they're transitioning.
Well,
when they
that
really
yeah,
don't need
Yeah,
But
I
to.
mean,
that's was the pro. That's what's so weird when we talked to Lance and Matt, where they just like couldn't even understand how this stuff is political. How any of the gender identity stuff is a political issue. To them, it's just has nothing to do with politics. And I'm like,
well,
wake
think
up!
about
What are
it
you
like
talking
this,
about?
right? If the leftist position is correct, and the leftist position is that like you don't need dysphoria to be trans, right? If that's correct, then like you can really identify as trans or as a gender not the one that you're assigned with at birth for any reason, including political reasons. And so it's no longer a strictly biological argument. So by leftism's like own reasoning, being trans is not something that's biological. It's something that like you can be for any sort of personal reason,
Yeah.
including political ones.
Pointing out
Well-
contradictions though is getting boring because it's like
Well,
there's
but
so
it's-
many of them.
It's just they talk out of. I mean, I guess that's somewhat true, but they talk out of both sides of their mouth. Because whenever I get in these conversations with people on the left about this, it's like they go, "Oh, you know," because I always go into this kind of biological essentialism for gender dysphoria and for transgender people, and they use that as the excuse to basically justify transition treatment.
Mhm.
But then they'll, as you said, Taf, they'll just go on and on about how, you know, out of the next breath, about how anyone should be able to transition for basically any reason.
Right, and
And you can never get like a consistent position on
these are not compatible positions to
Right.
have. Yeah.
Well, and the thing that's like right now, I'm sure you've seen like on Twitter, everyone's posting. There's that video of the kids at the drag queen dancing
Mhm.
club or whatever it is that everyone's going crazy about. And it's not only is that annoying to me because I see people like ContraPoints and Surfs and Big Joel and all these other like people who just seems like out of reactionary tendencies, just because they're reacting to the right, they go and have to defend, you know, having kids go to what is essentially a burlesque show
Right.
with drag queens. And it's so dumb because in any normal sense, most people would say, don't bring kids to strip clubs, don't bring kids to burlesque shows. But because it has this kind of gender identity slant to it, suddenly, you know, all these people on the left defend it. And it's, to me, it's even grosser because it seems like non-binary issues and drag queen issues kind of use transgender as like a shield to kind of sneak into the discourse and become acceptable. When, I mean, being into drag and being trans should have nothing to do with each other, and yet they're constantly conflated.
Right. And it's because like drag is seen as this like political statement for
Right.
gender abolitionism and against traditional gender norms in the same way that being trans is. And so I think a lot of more lefty leaning people, really view drag as like a political act and really, it's part of this whole politicization of everything in culture. Art becomes political, topics that really should not be political become political. So like, it's in my position that like trans healthcare is something that like you can find facts on, and there is like evidence that you can do experiments to find out what is appropriate responses, what healthcare is best, what leads to the lowest negative outcomes, and so on. And you can decide that on a scientific basis. And yet it is something that is like broadly politicized by the left and by the right in a way that just like you don't really see for other mental disorders. And
Hmm.
I think that this is like true of a lot of things, like masks and vaccines in like probably a better world would not be something that is like so highly polarized on either side, but they have become.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. I would actually be curious to ask, all the people defending this, the Contras and the Lances, do they even recognize that they view drag shows as political? I don't even know if they're like, would they openly acknowledge that? And that's part of why they're defending this stuff.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's so many situations where like they're just so frustratingly like destroyed by the political movement, which has politicized everything. But
Yeah.
I think it's, yeah, I don't know. I think it's an inevitable consequence also of democracy. And when you have
Uh-oh.
like political institutions that are demanding like buy-in from everyone, then
Uh-huh.
suddenly you have like, some guy in Texas, like where I am, who, has no relation to trans people, has never met a trans person, never interacts with them, but is like feels the need to have a strong opinion on the nature of trans healthcare. And really, he doesn't need to be. And like trans people and transition doesn't need to be something that is like, I don't want to involve the rest of the public with my medical scenario, right? That should be something between myself and my doctor and my partner. And
Hmm.
I don't really see the need to involve everyone with it. But because of like the mass politicization, we have like involving everyone. And yeah, I think it's very much like politicization is really synonymous with democratization of everything. And it's led to like really destructive effects in a lot of areas.
We did.
Well,
Oh,
I
go
mean,
ahead.
I kind of agree. I don't know. I would lay the blame less at democracy and more just at, I mean, I guess you could say that the way the media, I don't know, because it seems like right now it's just the battle lines are drawn so firmly because of the way media has realized that they need to make money via outrage,
Mm.
essentially. And the
Yeah,
easiest
that
way
too.
to build outrage is along these sort of political lines. And I mean, I guess you could say, if we didn't live in democracy, would that still be happening? I don't know, but
Yeah, I mean,
it's
I agree. It's really like this deadly combination of like modern media,
yeah.
mass media, social media, and democracy. Whereas like before in democratic systems, like in the United States, you have these like small groups, like trans people, right? And they're able to like negotiate with healthcare providers and doctors and whatnot and work
Mhm.
with like politicians, but it doesn't become like national discussion in the way that it has today.
Right. Everything is, yeah, everything right now has to become this massive national conversation. And you have to pick a side very quickly and
Even when
defend
it
that
doesn't
side
make
to the death.
sense. And like you can
Right.
really destroy your mental health, like agonizing over, what some random person on Twitter is saying. And really, it doesn't need to be that way.
Should adults without gender dysphoria be allowed to transition?
It depends on what you mean by transition.
This
I
is
think they
this
should
is
be
what
able
I
to
was
like socially
asking.
transition, like change their clothing
Sure.
and their
Okay.
name.
I'm assuming Adam means with hormones and
Medically,
surgeries.
I would,
Yeah, I guess there is that distinction. Yeah,
yeah, I don't
medically
know. I
versus
do think that
socially.
like ultimately it's this like libertarian thing, right? Where I think libertarians will say that like, yes, you have a right to like modify your body in whatever way you want. So there's a plane, it's probably really loud. Um, you have a right to modify your body in whatever way you want. And I think I'm sympathetic to that argument within other conditions. So like right now we have social media, which allows people to like propagate very dangerous ideas and suggestions to other people. And so like with social media's ability to like massively heighten insecurity, especially among like young women. And then you also have like this encouragement and this viewing of like being trans as like a way to escape, insecurity about your body. I think that like within that social condition, it makes sense to restrict people's freedom a little bit. And I think that like if we were in a social condition where there was less bodily insecurity that people were having, and there was less ability to like propagate transition as like a medical cure-all for everything, then I think in that scenario, it makes sense to like open up more freedom to modify your body in this way.
All of that, I mean, all that kind of seems irrelevant to me just because, I mean, obviously people are doing it because they think it would be cool, but that's really why anybody does anything, right? I mean, they think it will be fun and cool. So I don't necessarily know how that changes our outlook on prohibiting it.
So think about it like this. Imagine a world where like you have a lot less bodily insecurity, right? So like people, everyone, cis, trans, whatever. They're not
But you're just
seen-
saying there's no social pressure to do it. So
Yeah, exactly. So like imagine like a world where there's like very little social pressure to
so
transition.
are you saying people are doing it because of social pressure and not because they want to? You're saying the desire is coming from social pressure. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I think so. And so like the
Okay.
worry is that like you have this like external pressure, and people are responding to it. And it's like not a very good response to that social pressure and might, lead people to be more unhappy in the long run when they are
Right.
transitioning as a result of social pressure. Versus if someone were just transitioning because just like they thought it was cool like on their own without having like external pressure that makes them feel insecure, that might be something that's like more long lasting and beneficial.
Yeah. It's a tough one.
Yeah.
The non-binary stuff, Sitch, I guess you're against non-binary pronouns. I think the non-binary thing is interesting to me because people identifying as non-binary, it really seems like they're going for like a genderless type expression. Which how can you even call it a gender expression if it's a genderless expression? So what's your take on the non-binary thing?
Are you asking me or Sitch?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I think that like, I don't know. I know a lot of non binary people and I think sometimes, I mean, I think there's like a genuine like psychological thing that's going on where some people are just like not comfortable with either male or female expressions. And that's not something they can like easily modify within their brain. So I think that there's that. I don't think it's like purely just like aesthetics for people, although for some people it is just like purely aesthetics.
Well, I don't necessarily, I mean, I don't claim to know what's going on in people's heads. I can only see the outward expression of that. So, obviously people are trying to communicate things with any gender expression, right? I mean,
Mhm.
that's the whole point of expressing yourself in any way,
Mhm.
gender or just fashion or anything. So, yeah, I don't know. I don't know what's going on with the non-binary thing. I know it freaks a lot of people out. I'm less freaked out by it. I just obviously, like most people, if someone comes to me and says, "I want you to use they them pronouns," I'm gonna I'm gonna resist because it's a big ask. I didn't, obviously I'm going to mess up a lot because I didn't grow up using they, them pronouns. I'm sure younger people adapt to them much easier.
Mhm.
So I think it's like,
The boomer
it's,
defense.
Yeah.
it's a big ask. And I feel like, hey, I don't even know you. I just met you
Yeah,
and you're
but
already asking me.
is it because for me, I mean, I have a very, as you know, I have a very conceptual, like if I'm talking to someone and they're like, I identify as they, them, or whatever, like, I'm not going to be an asshole and be like, no, fuck you, I'm gonna call you he, she, or whatever, But I mean, I have a very conceptual reason for why I'm against it. As I've said a million times, it reinforces gender stereotypes,
Right.
and it
Mm.
completely goes against what I want society to look like, and to not put such importance on gender and all this other stuff. But I mean, with you, Adam, do you have do you have a conceptual reason for why you're against this, or is it just a big ask because you're a boomer and you're
It's
not
just
going to say
it's
correctly?
only that it's a big ask on, and I feel like 90% of the people making that ask are making it because they want you to fuck up so that they can cancel you. So
I don't
I
know
just
about
feel
that.
like it's a political game that they're playing that I don't want to be a part of. So
Okay.
But I think
just
there's
I
a
feel
lot of
like
reasons.
just stay away from me. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think
Half.
there's a lot of reasons. Like, I think there are like good and bad reasons to engage with like non-binary identity. So like I saw this post on Reddit. This person was talking about like their niece or something that like came out as non-binary in this big post. And like their reasons for coming out as non-binary were like saying that they were like too smart to be a woman and like too motivated to be a woman and so on and so on. And it was just like it reeked of like this intense misogyny and like a desire to like escape womanhood because of its associations with negative things, this like sexist stereotypes about womanhood. And so I think that like that reason to like identify as non-binary is probably not a good reason. And it's a reason that like reinforces negative viewpoints about yourself. But I think that like there are like legitimate reasons to identify as non-binary, and there's ways to like ask people to use gender neutral language with you that are like not super demanding, right? So like if someone is like, hey, I prefer gender neutral language, but like I understand it's difficult and like people are prone to mess up, that's okay. It just like sometimes makes me uncomfortable because I've got, you know, this internal mechanism in my brain that causes me to feel bad for like whatever arbitrary reason about this. I probably wouldn't phrase it in such scientific terms, but I think that's like a legitimate reason and a legitimate ask from people.
Well, I feel like they're foisting their religion on me too. It's like me walking up to somebody and saying, hey, I don't like it when you say geez or Jesus or goddamn or any of that stuff. And please don't do it in front of me because it's very offensive, because my religion is God is sacred and you should never take the Lord's name. It's like,
Well, I think
please,
that's a
I just met
reasonable
you.
ask,
Please.
right?
How about this? Fuck off.
What it isn't reasonable is to like enforce that by government, right? And to be like, you must use this language. Because I think that's when you get into like
Oh,
the
of course.
religious
Yeah,
demands.
that's the worst.
But like if a religious
that's
person
the
came up to
worst.
me and was like, hey, don't use the Lord's name in vain, I think that's like a reasonable ask that they could do. And like it's up to me to decide whether or not using, crying out like Jesus Christ is like something that's important to me enough that I'm going to split times with the person, or if it's something I can give way on.
I there's something I can look at it from a cultural evolution perspective, and there's something interesting going on here. And as just a lifelong artist, I'm kind of cool with people doing weird and interesting things.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one of the reasons why I don't necessarily object to the whole culture that's forming around it. It's just I feel like I don't forcing other people to participate on your new cultural development is just, that's not cool in my estimation. So that's why I draw the line. And a lot of the people in the trans and non-binary movement are very much in the position of, this is our ideological war, and we're going to make sure that we convert you, by the sword if need be. And that really offends my sensibilities.
Yeah, and not only that, people like make arguments to like by not gendering a trans person, right? You were like causing
Right.
suicides, right? Which is like
Misgendering. Exactly.
there's like
Yeah.
yeah, which is like an insane argument to make. And I think that's where you get into like some really scary stuff. Like I've also seen people make arguments or you just express feelings that like even if someone is gendering you correctly, if they don't really believe that you're a woman, like internally, it's still wrong. And I think then you're moving like even beyond like language control into just like concerning yourself with what people like really think. And their actual thoughts. And I think that's also like an inevitable and scary extrapolation from the logic that like you should be able to exert control over people's language.
Well, as someone who's pro-choice and has recently been identified as a baby killer, I got to tell you, it's a lot less. I'm losing a lot less sleep over, being responsible for people's suicide as well. I figure it goes with the territory. Sitch, you want to say anything about non-binary pronouns or?
I mean, I think it's important to, part of the problem with like the word gender identity is because it applies to both people with gender dysphoria and people without gender dysphoria. And I think these two things should be very distinct and separated from each other, because for a lot of the non-binary stuff, for people that I don't think have some biological reason for, wanting transition, for a lot of the non-binary stuff, it basically to me feels kind of like, when I was younger and, a lot of kids were going through like the goth phase, and, I knew kids that would, go to school with, the goth gear, and they would put the black eyeshadow and the white face paint on. And I know, their parents would be like, oh, I don't like that you're doing this. It's, it's gross. It's anti-Christian, or, whatever. They had some problem with people doing this. And the parents would be like, you're just going through a phase. And the kid would be like, this isn't a phase, Mom. This is who I am. It feels like some of, not all, but it feels like some of the non-binary stuff kind of falls into that same category with young kids who are just, it is this kind of aesthetic trend click. And the difference is that, when kids had these aesthetic click trends, for generations, parents would kind of poo-poo it, or they would just, hand wave it away. But now it's like, oh, you have to say that it's like a valid life choice. Like they have to actually acknowledge that this is who you are. And I'm not sure what kind of effect
And
it's
it's
going to have,
because it
for
uses
kids
that
growing
medical
up.
language, right? To justify.
Right, exactly.
Mhm.
Well, because it gets tied into this, like, with music, there's no like, oh, there's no history of like people being purged for their musical taste. I mean, there should be, but that hasn't occurred yet in American history. Where, with gender, it's, there has been a lot of violence against people for gendered reasons. So kind of they're able to kind of sneak in under that bar of acceptance. But
Right. And there's this big tension between people who believe that like gender identity is probably like innate and has to do with neurochemistry, and people
Mhm.
who don't believe that. And when you make arguments for like it's a legitimate lifestyle, it needs to be respected, a lot of those arguments stem from an understanding of gender identity as something that is innate and neurochemical and not easily changed. And therefore, like it's not just like an aesthetic choice. So like
Right.
it's like another big reason why it's like frustrating when people make arguments that being trans is just like, oh, identity, and like it doesn't matter, it doesn't correspond to anything necessarily in the real world, because it just destroys your ability to make arguments on the basis of like innate biological condition.
Mhm. No, I
Yeah.
think I got distracted by
Valid.
humor, and I forgot what I was going to
What
say.
happened?
But don't worry about it.
Was
Humor's
it
fighting with the chat. So
Humor's fine in the
Um,
chat. Humor's fine.
Did
Yeah, of
you
course.
listen to our conversation with Jay Exy? I think a lot of people
Not
got
sure.
triggered over that conversation.
Oh, what was the topic?
Well,
we were
Jay
kind of
is,
talking about the same stuff.
yeah,
Jay's far more permissive of basically, let people transition for any reason,
Hmm.
position. But
based.
I mean, I think
well,
like
I don't,
Yeah.
I see, I saw that movie and there's some people, there was one,
oh, that's what I was gonna say. Okay.
there's one person in there that was transitioned in his 40s from female to male, said they were a type A woman, go-getter, alpha female, and basically got caught up in this trans stuff through a therapist and completely regretted transitioning.
Well,
And I mean, if someone in their 40s can do it and totally
the
regret it, then
the
what chance does a kid in their 20s
the
have? So
interesting thing with that trans guy is that it wasn't clear whether he regretted it because he didn't think he was trans, or just that he had so many complications with all his surgeries, and he thought he thinks he's going to die basically pretty near in the future because he has so many infections and so many problems with his, especially his bottom surgery.
Right.
That seemed to be really the issue. I don't know if he ever said that he didn't think he was trans. He was upset that the doctors he talked to did not clearly lay out the risks to the
Right.
procedures.
He
that
didn't get
was
informed
getting.
Yeah.
consent. And
Right.
I don't necessarily know that you can give someone, you know, in their teens informed consent.
Well,
I
just
mean,
well,
what does
that's
that even
definitely
mean?
true. But also, I don't think what is really, because it's so wrapped into identity and protected classes, it's not really talked about that. I mean, especially bottom surgery is still in the early stages. It is still experimental in a ways. A lot of the ways that hormone blockers and cross-sex hormones, I mean, there hasn't been huge, long-term studies on a lot of these things. And if people still want to do it, I mean, that's okay, but you have to give the informed consent. You have to be realistic. And I don't think people are being real. I don't think a lot of doctors are being realistic when they
No,
talk to patients about
Yeah.
this stuff.
they should say right out of the gate, this is experimental surgery. There's not been a lot of study around it, and we're kind of making it up as we go along. So people know that going into it, instead of saying, oh, everything we do is reversible and the
Mhm.
outcomes are always great. It's so sad because a lot of these people, the doctors have every incentive to get people on this track because the doctors want to make improvements in this area, and the way to make improvements is to have a lot of people doing the surgeries and measuring the
Well,
outcomes.
they also make a
Yeah.
lot of money too. But
Well, that too, obviously, but they're forming a new technology that maybe 10 years down the road will be far more successful.
Mhm.
But the way to be successful is to continue for more people to opt in and try it. And this is like a gold rush for them in developing that new technology.
I mean, I don't know if you know this, but like there are large meta-analyses of HRT and its efficacy for people who are prescribed it, primarily gender dysphoric people. And those meta-analyses consistently find like very weak evidence. So like there's just like a lack of RCT trials. Most of the studies are done by surveys. So like they're going and asking people like, how do you feel about these? And
It's terrible.
which is
Right.
like a really, yeah, I'm glad you recognize this is terrible because it's like
Yeah.
not an effective way of gathering data. People like anorexics, of course, will say like, yes, I love losing weight. It's amazing. And like, it's so helpful for me. And they're completely
Yeah,
wrong.
exactly.
And so like this way of gathering data is just not good. So like we barely have evidence that like HRT is a good effective strategy for trans people, much less like more dramatic results. And I would be of the position that really what we need is to understand like if there are differences in the trans population and within the dysphoric population regarding like who is going to benefit most from HRT. I think it's possible that there are people who have like very low level dysphoria, and they are not going to be ultimately benefited by pursuing lots of surgery or HRT. And the downsides of these things, the risk of infection, the Herculean task of gathering up all of this money and spending all of this time to actually transition, does that ultimately outweigh? Is that ultimately worth it because of like a small amount of dysphoria? I would guess that like there are edge cases where people can genuinely be, diagnosed with gender identity dysphoria or disorder and not actually benefit necessarily from an HRT course or from surgery. And so even in like examples where people do have a medical need, I think that probably does need to be evaluated. And so the question of like, should anyone be able to have access to these surgeries and, these medicines? And I think that like in a perfect world, yes, because in a perfect world, people would have all of the information necessary and they wouldn't have external pressures causing them to be like insecure. But like the reality is that we don't exist in that perfect world. And there are all these other variables that make it more likely for people to end up regretting than they would otherwise.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, completely agree.
People, the gender dysphoria could resolve too, and that's the thing. Nobody wants to. They all want to jump in so quickly instead of, holding back and observing.
Yeah, and
Well,
notice that like ideally, if we're really caring about trans people, we should want to research these things and really rigorously like question if the medication we have is the best medication. Because that's what we
mhm.
do with every other mental issue is we rigorously test and question the efficacy of the treatments we're prescribing. But we don't do that with trans people. And the reason is because there's massive political pressure not to, and to just trust the current, like, the current prescriptions and not really view any testing or, questioning of that as ethical.
Well, I mean, part of the problem is like what they would have to do, I think, would probably be considered unethical
Yeah.
medically, which would be to have
Yeah, try to get it past an
like
ethics board. Unlikely.
right. But I mean, because what you'd really have to do is you'd have to have like 100 or 200 prepubescent kids that are deemed to have gender dysphoria by the same clinic,
Hmm.
and you don't give them anything
Hmm.
and until after puberty, and you see like, well, how many of these kids still have gender dysphoria after puberty and how many don't, and that would really be the only way to do. You have to do studies like that to really kind of make these determinations,
Yeah.
because I think what Adam and myself and a lot of other people kind of suspect is that if they did do something like that, you'd find like a 90%
Yeah,
desistance
desistance.
rate with a lot of these kids.
I don't know about
But
90%, but yeah, I also
yeah, that
suspect
could
that
be too
like
high. But
likely there's some group of people who are transitioning and don't need to be. That would be my
sure.
suspicion.
There was I think I wasn't a huge fan of the Matt Walsh documentary, because it does a documentary thing where it focuses a lot on like making you feel sad with
Mhm.
manipulation techniques as opposed to autistic data that I want. And like the trans man who was regretting the surgeries threw out all sorts of like really crazy statistics, like most people that are trans that want to commit suicide do so after treatment, and she gave some very high complication rate, and he didn't really look into any of these numbers, which I think would have been helpful if he did. But the most, I think the best part of the documentary was actually our boy Jordan Peterson, who showed up for like 2 minutes. But he said the problem is that people are basically, he doesn't like the term gender. He thinks the term gender kind of sucks. And really what's being talked about is just personality. What do you say, Adam? It was like personality traits or personality types. Use some word specifically.
Like the big
Do you
five
remember?
personality
I
model. It's
don't.
probably talking about like openness, conscientiousness, that kind of thing.
Yeah. But I forget. He used some, well, anyway, he was like, basically people are confusing personality types with gender, and just
This
like,
is a
yeah, people
Matt
can have,
Walsh documentary.
yeah, Jordan Peterson was in
Yeah.
it for
Oh,
like
you're
a little
right.
bit,
Yeah,
for a
of
tiny
course.
bit.
Yeah.
And he's like, there are
Uh-oh, we lost you, Sitch. Whatever you
people
said,
that
back
have
up.
the more masculine personality types, and that's fine. And this is being kind of rolled into gender, and it's completely confusing the issue. So
Yeah, that
anyways,
seems right to me as well.
we should talk about
Selector
we should
theory.
talk about the boring subject that no one cares about now.
Hell yes.
Well,
Okay.
it's not boring if we bring the drama into it
Elite
because
theory.
Yeah.
yeah.
The elite
So
theory.
yeah, Quackademic Agent is a big
Okay.
time elite theorist, and we all know he's full of shit. So therefore, elite theory has to be dumb and stupid. But I think, Calf, you're kind of into elite theory.
Yeah,
I
I'm definitely
suspect so.
sympathetic to it. And also, I have a unique experience of being very into Bruce Bueno de Mesquita and selectorate theory when I
Mhm.
was a teenager. So I've definitely, it sounds like you've read a lot of literature on both sides. So I'm not sure if I'll be able to give you many insights that you haven't heard already, but maybe I can be like a sounding board and
Right.
represent the elite theorist side a little bit.
We
I think
are
Adam's read a lot
you're
of.
not a neo-reactionary though, right? We got to straighten that out. Like the
Mm-mm.
neo-reactionaries are the ones that are like, elite theory is the greatest thing ever. Democracy sucks and doesn't work, and it's all just an oligarchy of elites.
I mean, I don't consider myself a neo-reactionary, but I do think that like many of the arguments made, or I don't consider myself a reactionary or neo-reactionary, but I think that many of the arguments put forth by elite theory are legitimate.
You think many of the arguments put forward by elite theory are legitimate? That
Yeah.
First of all, that's part of the problem, because elite theory and selectorate theory share a significant amount
true,
of
they do.
overlap. In selectorate theory, in the very beginning of the book, The Dictator's Handbook, Bruce de Mesquita and Alistair Smith come out and they say, listen, we compare selectorate theory to all of the great political thinkers. And Machiavelli was the one that came closest to getting it right. And he's basing that on data, hard data. He's done the evidence. And James Burnham, the guy who wrote the Machiavellians book that everybody likes, doesn't like that kind of hard data social science stuff. He actually makes fun of it in his book Suicide of the West. And so, I mean, he does list a bunch of Machiavellian thinkers, but he doesn't have any evidence to prove they're right. It's selectorate theory guys that have that evidence. So while there is a significant amount of overlap, where selectorate theory and elite theory diverge, it diverges so massively that it's contradictory to selectorate theory. So I don't think you can support elite theory and selectorate theory at the same time.
What would you say is in your opinion, the most significant divergence between selectorate theory and elite theory?
Well, elite theory argues that democracy is superfluous, that democracy doesn't actually do anything, because the elites are really controlling the electorate in a top-down way that it just doesn't make a lot of sense, because you have competing elites that are competing for voting blocks, and those voting blocks, yes, they can be influenced by different cultural shapers, different cultural elites, but those elites are their desires are not always aligned. They're often at odds with one another. So there are different elites competing for these different voting blocks and influencing different voter blocks. And it just, ultimately, people are more self-interested when they vote anyway. So that's my critique.
Yeah, so I think that what we should kind of distinguish here is the differences between democracy and electoralism. And you can have mechanisms for voting in people, leaders.
How are you defining electoralism?
Yeah, so you can have, I would just say electoralism is when you have mechanisms that involve voting and they allow you to elect or remove leaders. And so, like, in a corporation, you can issue voting shares, and people will buy these voting shares and they'll engage in electoralism, where they will elect people to a board of directors. But we wouldn't call that system democratic, because the people in general, shareholders, might, to use the language of selectorate theory, the winning coalition might be very small and therefore considered autocratic. And so the reason why it's important to acknowledge this is because elite theorists, and James Burnham makes some of these arguments. What is important is democratic institutions. And I believe he talks a little bit about juridical defense, and Mosca makes this argument. But basically, having these electoral institutions can allow you a mechanism for removing or bringing up or introducing people into the elite class. And so that's a really important mechanism. You brought up North Korea. One of the problems with North Korea is that there isn't a clear.
Can I address the corporate thing before you move on to North Korea?
The corporate thing.
Okay, so you said that, and he even acknowledges in the book that the small corporate board is basically an autocracy, and that corporations are run like autocracies. But there's another level of selection with corporations that is far more democratic, and it's the marketplace. So obviously corporations are competing on earning money, and the way to earn money is to earn profits. And the way to earn profits is to have large a large base of people buying your products. And in order to gain a large group of people buying your products, you have to cater to those people in the same way that politicians are forced to cater to large swaths of people in order to maintain themselves in elective office. So their similarities are far greater than the differences.
Yeah, so I don't know. I think that like we can get to that. But the reason I bring this up is because like selectorate theory is really like a two-vector analysis of politics. And it looks at like the selectorate, the winning coalition, and makes all of these predictions based off of that. But
right.
In doing so, it ends up capturing something which is important, which is electoral systems. And my point is that you can have electoral systems without having democracy. And you can have, and like the reason why electoral systems are important is because they allow some mechanism for meritocratic selection of elites. So like if you look at China, China has other systems for meritocratic selection of elites. They have like famously, difficult like Gaokao tests for measuring competency. They have this whole history of legalism. They have an understanding of like the mandate of heaven. And you have in Chinese culture like a ruthless systemization of bureaucratic selection for people who are going to be able to return on investment for the government in things. And so like that kind of selection for elites who are going to be competent in their positions is going to be something that results in better outcomes. And in fact, we do see that play out where China has had better outcomes than, for example, North Korea. And so I think that like one of the problems with selectorate theory is that if you look at these like old, I think 1999 and like 2003 papers by Bruce Bueno de Mesquita, the way that he's like measuring selectorate, it ends up capturing these electoral systems. And then when you control them out of the variables and you just look at like, for example, like leadership tenure, you actually find out that like a lot of the predictions made by selectorate theory aren't holding up. But yeah, sorry, you were going to say something.
Okay. So I don't know. I don't necessarily know about that. I would love to look at it though, if you want to send it to me.
Yeah, it's a little bit
on
dense,
on the meritocratic selection of elites. I understand that China has a different way of electing elites, but I think the American system is better because it's far more humble. We elect elites. Obviously they make all kinds of proposals that the people want, and whether or not those proposals are good for them or not is yet to be determined. So they elect that leader, and that leader stays in office on whether or not they follow through on their promises. So it's really a check on power, and that the Chinese system doesn't necessarily have that. So where they have, whatever they have on board of very smart people that pick whatever the leader is going to be, if that leader does policies that make the majority of the people unhappy, but make the leadership very happy, the leadership is going to perceive that as a success, even though it's not a success by any democratic measure, because most of the people are unhappy by it. So, I mean, I very much conceptualize voting as a poll of the population on, where we're at and whether or not we need to change policy prescriptions. So where a lot of people conceptualize voting on, we're voting for the leaders that have the policy proposals that are going to work. And, we need the smartest people voting for those policy proposals because we need to know, we need to have some assurances that it's going to work. I think that's full of hubris because nobody knows the future. Nobody knows the unintended consequences of the policies. And you as a conservative should probably take this to heart more than anyone. The law of unintended consequences is very real. So when that law of unintended consequences hits, if you don't have a way of polling a large body of people to see actually what's going on in the country, you don't necessarily know if you've hit hard times. And you don't have the voting base to get these people who, think everything is fine out of office.
So, yeah, I'm really glad that we're talking about China because I think it's very illustrative of some of the problems with selector theory. But there's a paper by Mosqueda, which he published in 2005, where he acknowledges that China has an incentive to provide some public goods, but mainly has an incentive to create good economic conditions for the people. So you brought up that like the market system is democratic in a way because the corporation wants to be able to provide good things and they get like stress tested by people's response to it. Well, the government actually has a financial incentive to provide increased economic well-being for people as well. And in Mosqueda's own words, it's so that they can levy taxes that are higher and therefore aggrandize themselves and their, and their cronies. And so this is like very much in line with what elite theory would argue. And it's that like when you have this system that is autocratic, there's still an incentive for the elites to improve the well-being of other people that isn't purely, virtuous or, self-sacrificing, but actually like it's within their interest to increase people's well-being so they can, extract higher taxes. And one of the problems with elite theory in that it's got this two-vector analysis, it sort of misses distinctions between autocratic nations. And so like you have something like China, which is autocratic, but operates very differently than North Korea, which is autocratic. And North Korea operates very differently than Singapore, which is, if not autocratic, at the very least, definitely not democratic. And so how do you like explain these differences? Well, it turns out that like the political systems within them have other mechanisms for allowing leaders to extract benefit from economic, success, and then also being able to, allow access to the elite class, and, encourage people to enter the elite class if they can do it better than another person. So like, yeah, there are all sorts of issues, and you see like resource dependent dictatorships, and Mosqueda talks about these as well, where like they might have very little incentive to actually build roads, to educate the population, to keep them healthy, because all of their revenue generation comes from sort of like renting out access to material resources to foreign powers. Versus you have like this tiny little island city state like Singapore, well, it depends a lot more on being able to have like an educated population in order for the elites to extract high taxes from them. And so like that distinction is not something that is like well captured within selector theory, but is captured by elite theory.
The idea that, the idea that elites have incentive to uplift the masses without any sort of electoral check on that just seems fanciful to me. It really does. Like I don't see,
because they benefit from it directly, at least in some circumstances.
In some cases they do, but in some cases they don't. And also, in selectorate theory, as the coalition gets smaller and smaller, each individual in the coalition has more and more power, and they are all gunning for that top spot. So that makes the smaller the coalition, the bigger target on the leader, and that just sets up a system where the whoever is in charge may have the most, the best of intentions for the population, but if they're not extracting enough wealth from that population to make the people who keep them in power happy, then the whole thing falls apart. And this is why, Russia is the perfect example of this. And Russia is Russia's like a dying nation that is lashing out on its neighbors because it's facing an existential crisis because of authoritarianism. So I don't.
Well, think about it like this, Adam. If Putin were to implement economic and social reforms that increase the well-being of the Russian people, allow them to be more productive and to generate more revenue per person, then he is able to extract higher taxes and therefore pay off his friends.
I think we're getting to the crux of the problem here.
Mhm.
If whenever you're in an autocratic regime and people know, and Putin gained most of his power by throwing the equivalent of Elon Musk, the Russian Elon Musk, in jail and expropriating his wealth.
Mhm.
If you live in that kind of atmosphere, what is your incentive to become the next Elon Musk just so you can be thrown in jail and all your hard work gone to waste and be spent by another dude?
Mhm. I agree that it's bad. And I think that like not only is it bad for the Russian people, it's ultimately bad for like the stability of Russian leadership. And we are in fact seeing like more and more protests like of the
If
government.
we saw that, if we saw that in the United States, if we say we saw a president incarcerate Elon Musk and take all of his money and assets, what do you think that would do to the technological the tech industry in the United States?
Yeah, so like imagining a world where this is like legal and like the president has the power to do these things, I think it would have a chilling effect on the tech sector, and therefore like tech is really big in the United States. I think it would have a negative effect on the economy in general. And if we have this like powerful president that is extracting wealth from the country, and they're like, they clamp down on their tech sector, effectively like destroying swaths of it or discouraging investment, that's going to be really bad for the person who is trying to extract taxes from their economy.
Yeah, this is, I think, the problem for me with just the whole idea of elite theory. You're just giving more power to people, more unchecked power, in just a way that I can't see how it would work.
Well,
Stitch, you want to weigh in here, or did you just go to sleep over there?
I mean, I
I
think
just
the
went to
thing
sleep.
is that like it can't be unchecked power. And sorry, I'll let Sitch jump in.
Well, but
No,
the
please.
argument for elite theory is that it is checked because everyone will have these magnanimous incentives because they want to make more money off the people,
Mhm.
which they do want to make more money off the people. But even in, how do you explain the study that they do in the Dictator's Handbook, where they look at autocratic regimes, and all of the autocratic regimes, the tax rates are like 90%. And in all the democratic regimes, the tax rates are, 30 to 50%.
I don't know. It's been too long since I read the book to talk about this exact study. Um, I vaguely remember like one of the ways that they calculate taxes for autocratic regimes is just by like they'll look at like an autocratic regime where a large section of the population is like growing things, they're like engaging in agriculture or resource extraction, and then the government, it won't have like a codified or like formalized tax law, but like they'll just like occasionally come up and like point guns at people and be like, well, we're taking all of this
No,
now.
you have a very good memory. They have these agriculture boards that set the price of certain commodities, and so the government buys the commodities at the government set price, and then they sell the commodities on the open market at the market price. And of course, they set the price super low so that they make all the difference. So the farmer ends up getting 10% of their crop value, and the government ends up getting 90% of their crop value, which is in effect a tax.
Yeah.
So yeah.
I mean, there's that. There's a lot of ways that leaders can generate money.
Sure.
And
Yeah.
a lot of ways that like leadership can be set up in autocracies where the incentives don't align. So like another example would be like if there's a hereditary monarchy in like Europe, right, where access to the elite class is like very closed. You might have it where like your society is generating very competent people, artisans, technicians, guild leaders, all these tradespeople who are very competent in their field, but are like fundamentally closed off from the elite power structure and the political power structure. And when that occurs, you end up having like these incompetent, like dying regimes, which are increasingly like unable to govern effectively and engage in just sort of like mafioso style behavior of like shaking people down and just using like violence to, you know, prop themselves up. And it's because they don't really like have effective competency or like ability to govern in a way that is going to generate long-term profits. And so the incentive structure is just like totally broken there. And so I think that like a good thing to acknowledge is that like being an autocracy is not good or bad necessarily, but like the institutions which surround the leadership structure really make the difference between success or failure. And like elite theorists will point to like this iron law of oligarchy, and they'll say that like in the United States we've got something called democracy, but when you look at like the preferences of elites, it turns out that the preferences of elites, they usually get implemented, and it turns out they actually align to a broad degree with the preferences of the population. But when they don't align, the government is much more likely to give out benefits to elites or special interest groups over the preferences of the general population. And so they'll say like, well, we've got democracy, but really what ends up happening is like the elite people in the society are the people who benefit most from the political process and engage most in the political process. But importantly, we have institutions like freedom of press and electoralism that allow very cheap and efficient transfers of power if someone's like incompetent, and two, a lot of insight and clarity into incompetence in the government. And so those institutions actually do matter. And I think that like elite theorists, if they're being honest with themselves, should make the argument that like these democratic institutions or institutions that are very common with democracies are important and do have beneficial effects. So, sorry, bit of a rant.
This study, it's bizarre to me that it's the neo-reactionaries and the communists both want to quote this study, this Princeton study, testing theories of American politics, elites, interest groups, and average citizens.
I'm pretty sure this is the study you're talking about. Who's the author?
Yeah, is this the study you're talking about?
Probably.
Martin Gillies and Benjamin,
yeah.
whatever. Yeah, okay. So
was
they
a
always
page.
want to promote this study. The neo-reactionaries and the communists reading the exact same study. In the study, they completely ignore. In the study, they completely ignore that the study is called Testing Theories of American Politics, Elites, Interest Groups, and Average Citizens. And while the average citizens, who probably don't vote, for heaven's sakes, don't get what they want, but the interest groups get what they want in the same percentages as the elites do, which is a point in favor of selectorate theory, because the interest groups form voting blocks. They what is it called? Damn. They lobby their constituencies and they actually get the things that they want. You can't do that in an autocracy. There's no such thing as lobbying in an autocracy. It's shut up and grow the wheat.
I think there's this like, we're using elite in like two different ways. I think in that study, they're really talking about like economic elites. And elite theory is talking about elites more broadly. So like, I guess it depends on the elite
Is it
theorist.
talking about cultural elites? I mean, I would think if you're a cultural elite, you're eventually going to be an economic elite, right? I mean, obviously, if you're a famous actor, you're going to make a lot of money doing that.
Well, yeah, there's a lot of ways to be very influential, right? And so I think in elite theory, when we talk about elites, we're really just talking about like very influential people. People who basically have the power to exert their will over the wills of others, which is like, I think that Mosquito uses this definition as well. And like when you look at special interest groups, they are elite by this definition, and that they are able to get their interests exerted in the political process over the interests of other people. And they're distinguished from economic elites in this paper, but that doesn't mean they're not elites in like the sense that elite theory or even Niskita uses the term, which is to say people who wield disproportionate power within the political system. They do that, and the way that they do that might be as simple as just having like more investiture and more willingness. So like if you look at local politics, you might have like some sweet old grandma who she's not rich, she's not super wealthy, she's not connected, but she's retired.
She's a member of AARP though, and they're connected as hell.
Okay, sure. But like she's retired and she spends like every weekend going to city council and like bothering them. And just because she like has this ability to constantly engage with the political process, she ends up having a disproportionate impact on that process. And so like
Right.
elite theory would like categorize her as part of the elites because she is able to have this disproportionate impact.
Okay. Okay.
But she wouldn't be elite like within the Giles and Page study. So
Well, I completely disagree with the fact that elite theory categorizes democracy as superfluous. And I just think that you're going to be dumber in life if you categorize democracy as superfluous. You're going to be less likely to vote. You're going to be less likely to participate in civics. And you're just going to be all around a worse off person for it. So that's my take. Sitch, what do you
Well, I
think?
mean, I could be not tracking the conversation, but it didn't seem to me that Taft was making the argument that democracy is superfluous. Is that what you were saying?
But that's the argument that elite theory makes. So that's why I'm saying that.
I think that elite theory makes the argument that like whether we label something democracy or not matters a lot less than like the actual on the ground existence of certain electoral institutions or like freedom of press institutions.
Okay.
And so they like make a distinction between these things. I think that like when we talk about democracy in the United States,
Can I ask you, are they making the same argument that the left is making about manufacturing consent? The elite theorists are basically saying because economic elites control newspapers and media that they can basically trick people into voting for whatever they want.
maybe that's part of it. I think that's a different route that I'm going down right now.
Okay.
I would just say, okay. I think that like when we talk about democracy, I think a lot of people are really what they're imagining is like American style democracy, which is a kind of democracy that allows a lot of special interests like lobbying and a lot of like influence from economic elites, right? And that's like we're labeling this as democracy, but it's not really democracy in the sense that like things are done by poll, right? And this is like, maybe that's like so obvious that it goes without saying, but I think that like really like true democracy is something that we call populism, which is to say that like the people are really, the ones whose interests are being seen turned into policy in the government. And that's not what we see necessarily. We don't see that America is like populist in this sense. So there's a mixing of words here
But all policy that they're proposing and passing, they're passing with the next election in mind, and they're voting on it with the next election in mind. And when certain policy proposals come up, like Biden himself said, listen, defund the police was horrible for us. Like it's so hard to get elected if you're proposing a policy to defund the police. So sooner or later, the electorate does come into play.
Yeah, for sure.
But in an autocracy, you don't have that because there is no electorate.
So, how do I say this? Yeah, kind of. So, like, the way that it comes into play is just different, is what I would say. And so, like, the kinds of public goods that are going to be distributed in China are going to be different than the kinds of public goods in the United States. So, like, China invests a lot in infrastructure and in train development, but they are highly restrictive of internet infrastructure and of that kind of freedom of speech. And I think that's a consequence of their kind of autocratic regime. And in the United States, you have,
Well,
you know,
let me stop you there for a
lots.
second.
Okay, yeah.
This is like a perfect example here,
Mhm.
because how do we know the population wouldn't rather have internet over trains if there's no process to poll the population on whether or not an internet or a train would personally benefit their lives and make them more productive?
Yeah, and the answer is that we don't know what the
Yes,
population would prefer. And in fact, the Chinese government is not that invested in what the people would prefer. They're not invested in that
right.
at all, really. What they're
But it,
invested in is creating like economic success that they can then extract wealth from.
but wouldn't you get more economic success in an environment where people were asked each individually, and each individual person had their own interest in their own economic success? So that would factor in whether or not they wanted a train or the internet. One person might say, well, a train would be better for me because I could get to my job. Another would say, well, I could get more jobs if I had the internet. And then averaging out those people via the democratic process, you would actually find out which would be more effective for a more productive populace, wouldn't you? I mean, that's why America works the way it does.
So we have examples of this. When Britain like asked their people, what do you think would be best for you if we stayed in the EU or if we left the EU? And they did a public poll, and the poll revealed that people thought they would be better off leaving the EU. And well, it turns out that when you leave important decisions like this to public poll, people are terrible at choosing good decisions because partly the way the poll is constructed and its inability to capture information results in people choosing like to leave the EU when there isn't really a process for that or a way of doing that that is ultimately going to benefit people. And so now, you know, Britain is leaving the EU and they're going to suffer economic consequences as a result of that.
Well,
And it's because people are like, the democracy, like averaging out process just
do you know
doesn't
that though?
play out.
Do you know that? Like, I would look at it this way, because the economic elites definitely said they would be tangibly damaged by leaving the EU. That was the argument that they made. And maybe they would be tangibly hurt by leaving the EU, but maybe the population would be better off by leaving the EU, and therefore that's why they did
Well, I
voted
think
in
they
their own
think they
economic
may be,
interests.
but like earlier we discussed anorexics. We discussed engaging in public healthcare policy or just healthcare by poll. And when you ask anorexics what they think is best for themselves, they say losing weight. When you ask trans people what they think is best for themselves, they say taking HRT. But I think we both agree that like this survey to figure out what kind of healthcare prescription is best is not a very rigorous way of doing it. And
Well,
so
and this is why I brought up the law of unintended consequences, because yes, the elites could pick a policy that's bad, the populace could pick a policy that's bad, but the process is there's the check and balance is whether or not the policy worked. If the policy didn't work, they throw their ass out of office. If the policy didn't work in an autocratic regime, they stay in office.
So the thing with like autocratic regimes, or at least like we're kind of a little bit moved to like theory here, but like if you have an autocratic regime, they have an incentive to gather up like the experts for trans healthcare and be like, what is the current data on this? Okay, you're going to go and have a conference and you're going to come out with like a conclusion about what's best. And then we're going to translate that into public policy. And we're going to tie like your salaries to the benefit of this policy.
I know this is totally Curtis Yarvin like nonsense, because this doesn't play out in the actual world. You can go to the internet right now and look up half a dozen foreign policy papers on how all of Putin's experts are lying to him because they're worried their head is going to be on a platter. So they can gather up those experts, and those experts, because of the incentives to stay alive, don't actually apply their expertise to anything. They tell the autocrat exactly what they want to hear.
I think, yes, but like ultimately, I think we both agree that like what would be better for Russia, for like the quality of life of people, and for the ability of people of the Russian government and therefore the oligarchs to extract wealth from the Russian people would be not to engage in this kinds of behavior. So this is like a losing strategy in the long term, and we're going to see that with like, the increasing pressure on Putin.
I completely agree with you there. But the thing is, there's a hierarchy of needs in the oligarchy, and the highest in the hierarchy is staying in power, because they know, especially in these autocratic regimes where the way that they amass power is by fucking over people. They know as soon as they lose that power, their life is on the line. So when it comes to, bettering the populace, sure, that always comes a distant second to staying in power. So right now, the oligarchic regime of Russia and Putin are more concerned with staying in power than bettering the populace. And this plays out in the real world. They're sending conscripts, people that are basically drafted into the Russian army as cannon fodder on the front lines. I mean, they don't give a fuck about those people.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that like a big reason for this, and for the reason why Russia's autocracy performs in this way, is because of the presence or lack thereof of certain political institutions around them. So like, this is why I bring up like electoralism and free press as like some of these institutions. When you have an autocracy that has more of these institutions, you're able to more effectively hold leaders to account and more effectively replace them.
What autocracy has a free press?
I don't know if I'd say like a fully free press, because it's part of the reason why they're autocratic. But like Singapore does a good job of holding leaders to account, rewarding them when they do well, and getting rid of them when they don't do well.
Sitch, you wanted to chime in a second ago. But...
Well, I was curious if Toph thinks, do you think China's form of government is going to create a richer, stronger nation in the future than America at some point?
Probably not. But
woo, go America. Thanks.
Yeah. I mean, I think like the key insight of elite theory is that like what you call your nation is not necessarily that important. The People's Republic of Korea like calls itself democratic, but ultimately the institutions are like set up in a way for Korea to not do well. And regardless, the reality is that both in democracies and not in democracies, there is like a Pareto distribution of people who have the most influence on policy.
Well, do you think there's any country right now that's going to do better than America in the future, whether it's democratic or not democratic?
No, I mean, I think that I'm bullish on America. I think America,
nice.
There's like so many elements of like the American liberal system that are just like very good and like very well set up. And America has like such geopolitical power that I think you're going to see like in China, massive demographic issues and like tensions with their neighbors, and probably like an inability to conquer Taiwan. And my prediction would be that like right now, America, I think, has a big crisis of confidence because we are seeing like these powerful challengers to global hegemony rise up on the stage. And I think that like we're going to see a lot of them turn out to be paper tigers, and American confidence in our own system of government is going to increase.
Based. So is there any reforms in America you like to see that reflects elite theory, or
that reflects elite theory? I mean, I think just like an honesty with ourselves about the political process is good. Understanding that like there are groups of people, or just that like a small numbers of people are going to have outsized influence on politics. And if you want to understand like how America's operating on a national level, you have to understand the people who are elite in America. So like elite institutions like Harvard, they tend to have a political slant. They tend to engage in like kind of political echo chambers, especially like we discussed on like issues of social justice. So if you want to understand like why do we have social justice like that is so politically powerful and yet only like 6% of Americans are progressives, well, it probably has something to do with elite institutions like Harvard, Yale, or powerful media institutions and their outsized impact.
Sure. I mean, but I guess I'm working under the assumption, I could be wrong, that most people already believe that and agree with that.
I think that's true to an extent. I just think that like if you want to improve America and a lot of its culture, I think that you should focus on the cultivation of an elite class that really has good values that are
Sure.
yeah. So like I think that if you want to have change, especially like if you want to preserve like the liberal tradition, or if you want to have right-wing change, the way to do that is to really cultivate a powerful liberal or right-wing intellectual movement that is capable of drawing in elites and capable of rewarding people for engaging in it in a way that is competitive with the current progressive or left-wing institutions which do the same. So yeah.
I mean, I don't necessarily disagree. I guess it's hard for me to visualize how that would come to pass,
Yeah.
especially with right now, since not only is there such a elite capture is so much, to the left, especially if we're talking about colleges and media, but then on top of that, because of that elite capture, I mean, currently the right has become so anti-elitist
Yeah.
that it would be very difficult to try to get the right on board with like, we need to take back the elites.
The right is
Just-
very populist at the moment. Yeah.
Exactly. They're just like, fuck the elites.
And part of that is like anti-intellectualism, where like a
Yes,
lot of right-wing
yes.
people, it's so sad to see, like increasingly believe
Yeah, I know.
in insane conspiracy theories. And
Yeah.
like, I think if you want to
Academic
have
agent,
like,
he's lost his mind.
I don't know this person, but like, if you want to have an effective like mount of force or challenge to the progressive establishment, you need to not engage in like insane conspiracy theories or anti-intellectualism, because it's not going to help you.
Right.
So yeah. Have I been a good sounding board for elite theory? Have I helped express their arguments a little bit?
Have I changed your mind at all? I feel like maybe I've made a dent.
Maybe, yeah. I mean, I think that like I was going over a lot of research before this conversation, just like reading old selectorate theory articles. And I think that like one thing that I have to contend with more is like the very genuine fact that things that are considered democracies by Bruce Bueno de Mesquita's, categorization model do tend to do a lot better. And I think that that's something that like is really it is like a serious challenge to some assumptions that elite theorists have.
Well, the technical aspect of it just seems unassailable to me. It's like if you have an elite that needs 70 million Americans to show up in order to keep their president in office, then you have to come up with public policy that's going to make 70 million people happy at bare minimum. And that is a tall order, a tough challenge. But in an autocracy where in order to stay in power, you have to make 200 people happy, focusing on good public policy for 70 million people is it's a fool's errand. I mean, you're really focused on extracting as much wealth from those 70 million people as possible and giving it to the 200 people that you have to grease their palms so you stay in office. And it's just that technical aspect of it just seems, I mean, I don't know how you get past that.
Well, I think the way that you get past it is by differentiating between like good public policy and public goods. And so like what selector theory argues is not that like autocracies aren't going to be willing to create economic prosperity for people, but that they're going to be stingy with their distribution of public goods. And so like some public goods, like the internet is one that Mosquito uses in talking about China. They're stingy on this good, but they're liberal on their spending with like infrastructure, and that's really explained by their winning coalition versus selectorate ratio. And so there is an incentive for elites in autocracies to engage in policy that results in economic prosperity, but not necessarily to create public goods. And again, I think it goes back to this discussion of like doing policy by poll or by survey. And I would argue that when you politicize things, when you democratize decisions on especially very technical questions like trans healthcare or vaccines or Brexit, these are scenarios where the public position is not going to be what is like technically best.
The public could, this comes up a lot, and I do agree with you. Okay, the public could be wrong, but the elites could be wrong too. The thing is, it's not a prediction mechanism, and it's complete hubris to look at it that way. It is a look at what happened when we implemented that policy, and it turned out to be a disaster. We need to vote this guy out of office. Where if you don't have that sort of check, then they can stay in office forever with terrible policies.
Yeah,
is the
I
argument,
agree.
Adam, that with the elite, within our democracy, it's much easier to course correct than with
Yes,
elites?
yes,
Yeah, okay.
yes.
And so this is why I bring up something like electoralism, because I think that in an effective autocracy, you have to have efficient mechanisms for removing or promoting elites who do good or do poorly. And like when you look at like a corporate autocracy, a corporate autocracy lives or dies based on its ability to promote good leaders and to fire bad leaders. And it's the
Right, but
same
there's a
thing in the
democratic
political
process.
realm. Yeah, exactly. And so like if you have a country that is effectively able to say, listen, you made this decision and it resulted in our GDP growing by like this amount. So you're going to take some of that spoils. Good job. Or, in the inverse, you made this decision, you got your experts together, you made it, and it resulted in, losses, then you're going to get punished. A big problem with, and a big distinction between like corporate autocracies and government autocracies is that like in a corporate autocracy, you have oftentimes the board of directors and they're sort of managing the CEO and they're appointing him, hiring him, and they're like evaluating his performance. And they are like, interested in extracting these revenues from the company. But in a lot of political autocracies, what you have is like a merging of these two organisms. And if you have like one person who's both making the decisions and evaluating his own performance, then that's probably pretty bad and is going to result in negative results.
Right.
I think I see that. To me, the issue is when I look at political systems, I always tend to think or predict that everyone's going to behave as poorly as possible. And I think that the political system needs to sort of be designed around that idea. And it feels like kind of using the corporate structure, it's too easy for corruption to seep in and to not be able to be removed from the system except for some kind of violent revolution, which
But you don't see
really
violent
don't
revolutions in
want.
corporations and private corporations.
Well, no, yeah, right, because it's about, you just fire someone, right? They're not controlling your life, like it's just your job. But if the country was run like a corporation, you would basically have to have a violent revolution if there was corruption issues at the top. And that's always such a problem. This kind of came up in our conversation with Aiden, which is that, you can always, she was kind of saying, and a lot of the anti-democracy people are saying, you can always have a revolution basically if there's too much corruption. But what is not accounted for, besides obviously any violence that would come through the revolution, is that there's very little guarantee that the revolution would bring about a better government.
Yeah, that's
or
a
would even bring
terrible
about the
argument.
same or would bring about the same type of government with better leadership, when usually the revolution is going to bring about a completely different type of government, and there's a high chance it would be, like a socialist government if we're going from a, some sort of corporatocracy.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
I don't know. I guess that's my problem with a lot of the way this is conceptualized. I don't see. It seems to me that democracy has a lot more safeguards attached to it inherently.
Yeah, and I think that I mean, if you're ever designing like a political system, and like a big part of your political system is like, oh, if things go bad, we'll just have like violent, bloody revolution. That's really not a place you want to be, because
You're right.
revolution is so dangerous. It's like
Yes.
ultimate destruction. So yeah, you don't want to rely on that. One thing that I think we haven't like talked about as well is like freedom of movement, and how people move between governmental systems. Because like if you go back in time in history, your ability to move across borders and like integrate into new societies is, you have a lot more ability to do that than modern day, and that's true even going back like 200 years ago. And I think that like one of the results of democratization is that when you have someone entering your country, you are, sort of tacitly giving them some power in your system. And therefore, you have like a lot more incentive to regulate who you're letting into your government, or into your nation. And so it's a little bit like if you were to force corporations to give every worker a vote, well, suddenly they're going to be very stingy on like who they're allowing into the company. Or if you're forcing corporations to give everyone like a share of profit whenever they're hired on, that increases the cost of hiring people into your company. And so that also decreases like your incentive to allow people to move freely. And as on the same token, when you have like freedom of movement between countries, you also increase the incentive for governments to provide public policy. Because if you provide poor enough policy, and you result in economic ruin, then the result is people leaving your country and no longer being able to tax them. If you have somewhere like North Korea, where the borders are like effectively shut down, you don't really have as much incentive to like be good to your people, because they can't really leave. You can just like extract rents from them endlessly.
Yeah. That's why it's a terrible situation.
I mean, I agree with everything you said in theory. I think though that when it comes to the average citizen, I don't think that's the thought process of why people are very anti-immigration. I think it's more just this fear of like the culture being taken over, or their job being taken, or that there's some sort of negative corrupting influence that's coming from the outside. That gets tied into, like Tucker and all these people kind of tie it into voting blocks. But I mean, because like with illegal immigration, the people that are sort of freaked out about that, I mean, that doesn't even have anything to do with voting, because illegal immigrants can't vote. So I guess I agree exactly what you're saying in theory. I think the emotions of immigration are tied to something very different.
I think that's true. A lot of like, there is like this emotional appeal that is just like very cultural, and it's like, regardless of their ability to vote, immigrants or illegal immigrants are going to change things, and it's going to result in worse outcomes for you. Or
Right.
there's an element of racism. You don't want to see like brown people around you.
Mhm.
So I think that's part of it. And the reason why I bring up like government incentives regarding like voting and distribution of public goods is just to like give a more realistic perspective on why governments may become like more willing to enforce their borders with the increased democratization, because introducing new citizens is more of a burden than if you have like an autocracy where you don't really care.
Sure. Maybe.
And
What do
in,
you think the motivation is for people who are engaging in elite theory, who are like promoting it and whatnot?
they probably think it's correct, right?
Well, there's no academics, any serious academics looking at elite theory or studying elite theory. It always seems to be these
I don't think that's true.
neo-reactionary types.
There's like a good analysis of literature on elite theory that's like continual.
In current day or 50
I
years
believe
ago?
so. I was recently reading this like yeah, I was recently reading this like analysis of a bunch of like the current state of elite theory. I wonder if I could find it for you.
Well, I know that Quackademic Agent wrote a book talking
Well,
about reviving elite theory.
well, hold on, because why, whether like academics are talking about it or like it, I mean, I don't see how that's important really at all to the question that you asked, which is why are people engaged in elite theory? What is motivating people to be into it?
Mhm.
And is it, I mean, because it seems to be primarily coming from people on the right and the very, I guess, technically the very far right. If you're anti-democracy, you have to be on the far right. And is it not appealing to people on the left whatsoever, just because basically communism is elite theory on the left already, and we just don't conceptualize it that way?
Okay. I have like personal theories about this, but
Okay, I want to hear.
take them with like a big
I
grain
wanna-
of salt because I don't know how true this is. But I think that like I think that in the 20th century you had like three big political movements rise up. You had like communism on the left, you had liberalism, and you had fascism. And all three of these movements in rhetoric made appeals to the will of the people, but fundamentally disagreed on who constituted the people. So, like, communists argued that, like, the people were the proletariat and they ought to have control over the government. And fascists argued that the people were, like, a specific racial or ethnic group and they ought to have control over the government. And liberals argued that like the people were the citizenry and they should have sway over the government. And I think that like the reason why you see elite theory really prosperous on the right is because reactionary philosophy essentially rejects like all three of those arguments, where it says like the people should not have influence in the government, and the people who should have influence are like technocrats or monarchists or those sorts of, or aristocracy, right? They're going, and by making those arguments they're hearkening back to political theories that were pre-modern, that didn't make appeals to the will of the people. And so I think that's why you see it more on the right, is because it's essentially tied in with this like reactionary rejection of modernist political theories, which all in some way appeal to the will of the people.
We have another guest coming on too, just to let you know.
That's fine. I really enjoyed this. You guys are fun to talk to.
Yeah, we should do this again, definitely.
Yeah, it was cool.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I know that I think we both have a mutual friend in Dev's perspective, Shofet Otaku.
Ew, you like Dev? God,
Yeah,
crap.
he's great.
Ugh.
Yeah.
But yeah, I've talked to him a lot, but I haven't talked to you. So it was fun to make that connection.
Yeah, you
Awesome.
snipe at me on Twitter from time to time. I
Mhm.
get maybe more about trans stuff than, I mean, the trans stuff does kind of fascinate me, but obviously politics and morality fascinate me as well. So
Mhm.
I did look up whether or not I did go to Google Scholar and type in elite theory, and there is some stuff. I guess I feel like I never really see this come up unless it's some reactionary source. So
Well, because
Yeah,
I guess it's as Task was saying, it's inherently postmodern or
that's how
pre-modern
I
types of
characterize
thinking.
it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right. So
That's my personal theory as to why the right seems especially attracted to it.
hmm
But yeah, I don't know if that's exactly true, but that's my theory.
sure.
But yes, shall I say goodbye? It was lovely.
Yes, thanks for coming on. We really appreciated talking to you.
For sure. It was fun. You guys have a good
Yeah.
one.
All right, you too.
Bye-bye.
Whoa, okay. Good stuff, guys. Good 2-hour conversation. Banger. I think that's probably gonna be it. That was fun. I think I'm going to have conversations with people on Friday as well as Saturday. So we'll look out for that. Maybe I'll do this again tomorrow. Amazonian word warrior. So true. But yeah, I will probably end stream today. And I do think it'd be good to do more just casual streams in the afternoon. So might do one tomorrow as well. It was fun, guys.